They were branded murderers, sentenced to death, and executed by the state. But what if they were innocent all along? Imagine spending years in prison, knowing the truth, only for others to realize their mistake when it's too late to fix it. From faulty science to coerced confessions, these cases illustrate how quickly justice can go terribly wrong. And the worst part? It still does today. Number 1. Cameron Todd Willingham. Cameron Todd Willingham's case is the most shocking failure of justice. In 1991, a brutal house fire in Corsicana, Texas, killed his 3 young children. Willingham was accused of setting the fire on purpose and was tried for arson and murder. Prosecutors relied on outdated fire science methods at his trial, which concluded the fire was set on purpose. Although he had no motive and evidence showed he tried to save his children, Willingham was found guilty of the crime in 1992. Years later, advancements in fire investigation proved the original claims were completely wrong. Experts determined the fire was likely an accident, not an act of arson, but it was too late. Willingham had already been executed in 2004. His pleas for new evidence were rejected. The case was widely covered by media like The New Yorker and documentaries like Netflix's The Confession Tapes and the film Trial by Fire. Today, many view Willingham's case as a chilling reminder of how bad forensic science can lead to irreparable tragedy. Number 2. Timothy Evans. Timothy Evans's story had a huge impact on the UK and played a role in ending the death penalty. Evans was convicted of murdering his wife and infant daughter in 1949 in their Notting Hill, London home. During his trial, he accused his neighbor John Christie of the murders. But nobody listened. Evans was convicted on weak evidence and testimony by Christie, who seemed convincing at the time. 3 years later, the reality came out. Christie was a serial killer who murdered many individuals, including Evans's family, but by then, it was too late. Evans had been executed in 1950. The news was shocking and prompted the government to reconsider the death penalty. His case was a reflection of miscarriages of justice and was the inspiration behind the 1971 film 10 Rillington Place. Today, Evans is remembered as an innocent man whose wrongful execution changed history and helped prevent future injustices. Number 3. George Stinney Jr. At 14 years old, George Stinney Jr. was the youngest to be executed in the U.S. in the 20th century. In 1944, 2 young white girls went missing in South Carolina. Their bodies were found a few days later, and Stinney, a black teen, was quickly suspected. He was arrested in front of his parents, and he supposedly confessed to the murders. But there is no written confession, and his family said the confession was coerced. His trial lasted just 10 minutes, and an all-white jury found him guilty in under an hour. There was no physical evidence against him, and his lawyer hardly questioned the accusations made against him. Years later, in 2014, a court overturned his conviction, ruling that he hadn't been given a fair trial. Evidence suggested he was probably innocent, perhaps framed because of racial bias. Stinney's case shocked the nation when it re-emerged into the news, covered by big media names such as The Guardian and The New York Times. Now, George Stinney Jr. is remembered as a child denied justice, and his story stands as a powerful reminder of systemic racism and the failures of the legal system. Number 4. Carlos de Luna. In 1983, Wanda Lopez, a clerk at the city of Corpus Christi, was brutally murdered. De Luna, a young Latino, was arrested after being spotted at the scene. The sole witness later identified him as the killer, although the evidence was weak and there was no physical proof connecting him to the crime. At the trial, De Luna professed innocence and accused another man, Carlos Hernandez, of the crime, but his alibi was ignored and he was convicted largely on the witness's testimony. Years later, an investigation by Columbia Law School uncovered shocking details. Carlos Hernandez, a violent offender who looked like De Luna, had repeatedly claimed he was the real killer. By then, however, it was too late. De Luna had already been executed in 1989. His case gained new prominence through The Guardian and the movie The Phantom, published in 2021. Today, Carlos de Luna is remembered as a victim of a flawed system, and his wrongful execution is a warning against trusting unreliable testimony. Number 5. Johnny Frank Garrett. In 1992, Texas executed a man for a crime that another man likely committed. Johnny Frank Garrett was only 17 when he was accused of the gruesome murder of Sister Tadea Benz, a nun in Amarillo, Texas. The case against him was weak, based on a questionable eyewitness identification and a confession he said was forced. Though there was no physical evidence against him, Garrett was found guilty in 1982. Years after his death, DNA tests pointed to another suspect, Leoncio Perez, who could have been the real killer. By then, Garrett had already suffered the worst punishment. His story horrified the nation when it reappeared in the documentary The Last Word from 2008 and inspired the horror film Johnny Frank Garrett's Last Word from 2016. Garrett's case is a terrifying reminder of how easily the justice system can fail, especially when relying on forced confessions and weak evidence. Number 6. Derek Bentley. The film Let Him Have It from 1991 dramatized one of the most debated cases in British history that exposed major flaws in the justice system. Derek Bentley, aged 19 and suffering from learning disabilities, was executed in 1953 for a murder he did not commit. The fatal shot was fired by his 16-year-old co-accused, Christopher Craig, during a failed burglary. But Bentley was the one who was found guilty under the controversial law of joint enterprise. Bentley's reported words, "Let him have it," were central to the case, but to this day, people still debate what he actually meant. His trial did not consider his mental challenges, and while Craig was too young to receive the death penalty, Bentley was sentenced to death. Years later, in 1998, Bentley was officially pardoned after new evidence proved his conviction was wrong. His case led to books, films, and national discussions about how the justice system treats people with disabilities. Number 7. Ruben Cantu. Ruben Cantu was executed in 1993 for a crime he may not have committed, a murder during an attempted robbery in San Antonio, Texas. The evidence against him was based mainly on the word of one witness, Juan Moreno, who survived the assault but initially told police that Cantu was not the murderer. Years later, Moreno took back his statement, saying Cantu was innocent. No physical evidence linked Cantu to the crime scene either. His co-defendant, David Garza, later stated that Cantu had been wrongly accused. Cantu's appeals were denied despite this new evidence. By the time the truth started to come out, it was too late to stop his execution. The Houston Chronicle and other true crime publications investigated his case years later. Ruben Cantu's case illustrates how unreliable witness testimony can cause tragic mistakes, leaving behind injustice and unanswered questions. Number 8. Jesse Tafero. Jesse Tafero's case is one of the most infamous wrongful executions in American history, not only because he was innocent, but also because of the gruesome way he died. In 1976, 2 police officers were murdered at a rest stop in Florida. Tafero was convicted of murder, mainly based on the testimony of his girlfriend, Sonia Sonny Jacobs, and their friend, Walter Rhodes. Rhodes, who later admitted he was the real killer, made a deal with prosecutors and testified against Tafero. While there was no physical evidence against Tafero, he was sentenced to death. Rhodes's confession and serious flaws in the prosecution's case were revealed during his appeals, but they were ignored. Tafero was executed in 1990, and his death was especially horrific. Fire erupted from his head due to a botched electric chair procedure. His case gained a lot of publicity, with newspapers like The Guardian and the New York Times questioning whether his trial was fair. Years later, Tafero's family is still fighting for an official declaration of his innocence, a painful reminder of how easily the system can destroy an innocent life. Number 9. Thomas and Meeks Griffin. In 2009, nearly a century after their deaths, Thomas and Meeks Griffin became the first people in South Carolina to be officially pardoned after execution. The black farmers were executed in 1915 for murdering a wealthy white man, John Q. Lewis. The brothers were convicted based on questionable testimony from John Monk Stevenson, a convicted felon who claimed the brothers hired him to commit the murder. Stevenson later admitted he had made up the accusation to get a lighter sentence, but it was too late. The trial was highly racially biased, and there was no physical evidence linking the Griffins to the murder. Appeals argued there was no solid proof against them, but the courts refused to reverse the conviction. The brothers were executed despite their community knowing them as honest, hard-working men. Their case was forgotten until advocates sought justice many years later. The pardon acknowledged the wrongful conviction they suffered, but could not undo the damage caused by a broken justice system. Number 10. Claude Jones. Claude Jones' case was decided based on a single strand of hair, and that hair may have cost him his life. Jones was found guilty of killing Alan Hilzendager during a robbery in a Texas liquor store in 1989. The main evidence against him, a hair sample found at the scene, claimed to belong to Jones. New DNA testing later proved what Jones had said all along. The hair wasn't his. The trial itself had major flaws. Nothing else physically connected Jones to the crime, and his co-defendant received a lighter sentence in exchange for testifying against him. Appeals focused on the lack of solid evidence, but they were denied. By the time DNA testing cleared his name in 2010, it was too late. Jones had already been executed in 2000. His story was widely reported by outlets such as the Texas Tribune and advocacy groups fighting for criminal justice reform. They saw his case as a tragic example of how bad forensic science can lead to wrongful executions. Number 11. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. The famous Leopold and Loeb case shocked the country in 1924, but behind the sensational headlines was a serious question of justice. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, two wealthy University of Chicago students, kidnapped and killed Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy, to try to pull off the perfect crime. While both were guilty of the brutal murder, there is still debate over how much responsibility Leopold should have taken. Some experts believe Leopold was pressured into accepting more blame than he deserved, and many argue that Richard Loeb was the mastermind. When their case went to trial, the famous defense lawyer Clarence Darrow helped them avoid the death penalty, but controversy remained. Leopold later claimed he was pressured into confessing and that Loeb had tricked him into participating. The media frenzy surrounding the case inspired movies like Rope, 1948, and Compulsion, 1959. But news reports often overlooked that Leopold may have been unfairly blamed. While both men were guilty, this case shows how confessions can be shaped by power, manipulation, and outside influence. Number 12. Will Purvis. The last in our lineup is Will Purvis, a man who survived his execution and later proved his innocence. Born in 1872 in Mississippi, Purvis was a young farmer with a peaceful life. That changed in 1893 when a local farmer, Will Buckley, was shot and killed. Purvis was suspected because of a feud with a secret group known as the Whitecaps. In 1894, a jury found him guilty of murder based on weak witness testimony without any physical evidence. Sentenced to hang, his execution took a shocking turn. The noose failed, and he fell to the ground alive. The crowd saw it as a sign of innocence, but the state still planned to retry him. Purvis's luck held out. His friends helped him escape, and he remained on the run. Then, in 1917, a dying man confessed to killing Buckley, finally proving Purvis was innocent. By 1918, he was formally exonerated and received $5,000 from the state. The New York Times covered the story widely, calling it a rare case of justice finally being served. Purvis lived freely until 1938. What are your thoughts on these tragic tales of wrongful executions? Was there a particular case that stood out to you? Or do you have another observation to make? Share it with us in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts. If you're interested in more thrilling tales of crime, justice, and the individuals involved, subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.